When I turned 64, I realized being forgotten hurts less than being deliberately erased. I had spent 3 weeks planning my birthday dinner, not because I expected anything extravagant, but because I believed, perhaps foolishly, that family still meant something in this house. I polished the silverware until I could see my reflection in it, set the table for 8, and arranged fresh lilies in the center, the same kind my late husband used to bring me every spring. The oven hummed softly behind me, keeping the roast warm, while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual, each second stretching longer than the last. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. By 6:30, the candles had already burned halfway down. I checked my phone once, then twice, then a third time, convincing myself there must have been traffic or maybe a last-minute delay. Daniel always ran late. Jessica always had some excuse. That's what I told myself, standing there in my navy dress, the one I hadn't worn since our 40th anniversary. By 7, the silence had settled into something heavier, something that pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't shift. No calls. No messages. Just quiet. I sat down at the head of the table, looking at the empty chairs, each one carefully placed with a name card written in my best handwriting. My son. My grandchildren. Even Jessica. Especially Jessica. At 7:15, I made the mistake of opening social media. There it was. A photo posted just minutes earlier. Daniel smiling wide, his arm around Jessica, the kids laughing beside them, all standing under a string of glowing light somewhere I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Family Night Out." Exactly what we needed. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, zooming in as if the pixels might reveal something different the second time. They weren't stuck in traffic. They weren't delayed. They had chosen somewhere else. Without me. I set my phone down carefully, as if it might shatter if I held it any tighter. The candles flickered in front of me, their light dancing across the empty plates. I reached out and extinguished one with my fingers, then another. Until smoke curled softly into the air. That's when I heard it. My phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, but a message. Not from Daniel. Not from anyone in my family. An unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, my thumb hovering just long enough for a strange feeling to settle in my stomach. Then I read the message. You weren't supposed to see this yet, but you deserve to know what she's planning. Below it was an image. A screenshot of an email. Jessica's name at the top. Words I couldn't fully process at first, my eyes catching only fragments: transfer, property, after her birthday, easier once she's out. I felt something inside me go still. Not broken. Not shattered. Just still. The kind of quiet that comes before you finally understand everything. I looked around the dining room one more time, at the untouched food, the empty chairs, the life I thought I still belonged to. Then I picked up my phone again, read the message a second time, slower this time, letting each word settle exactly where it needed to. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I simply sat there, in the soft glow of dying candlelight, and realized this night hadn't gone wrong. It had gone exactly the way someone wanted it to. I did not reply to the message right away. Instead, I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table, right beside the untouched plate that still held a slice of roast I had carefully prepared hours earlier. The house felt different now, not just quiet, but hollow in a way that made every small sound echo too loudly. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly sliding across the walls before disappearing. I sat there for a long time, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring at nothing in particular while my mind slowly began to rearrange everything I thought I understood about my family. It was not the first time I had been left out. That realization came to me with a strange sense of clarity, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle that had been sitting in front of me for years. There had been other moments. Small ones. Easy to explain away at the time. A birthday party for my grandson. That I somehow arrived late to, only to find out it had started an hour earlier than what Jessica had told me. A Christmas dinner that was suddenly changed to a small gathering, only for me to later see photos online filled with people I recognized. Even a simple school recital where I had been told the wrong date, leaving me sitting alone in an empty auditorium while my granddaughter had already performed the night before. Each time, there had been an explanation. A misunderstanding. A simple mistake. That was what I chose to believe. It was easier that way. Easier than questioning my own son. Easier than imagining that someone would go out of their way to slowly remove me from the life I had spent decades building. But tonight was different. Tonight did not feel like a mistake. It felt organized. Intentional. I reached for my phone again, unlocking it slowly, and opened the message once more. The words had not changed. The meaning had not softened. After her birthday. I read that line again, letting it settle deeper this time. After. Not before. Not someday. After. As if tonight had been a checkpoint. As if they had been waiting for this moment to pass before moving forward with whatever came next. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, my eyes drifting toward the hallway where family photos lined the wall. There was one of Daniel at age 5, grinning with missing teeth. One of him at his high school graduation, standing proudly between me and his father. And then the newer ones. Wedding photos. Holiday pictures. Jessica always in the center, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, her smile perfectly placed. I had never questioned it. Not really. I had told myself she was just organized. Just particular. Just someone who liked things done her way. I had adjusted. I had stepped back. I had made space. Because that is what mothers do, or at least what I believed mothers were supposed to do. But sitting there in that dimly lit dining room, I began to see something else. Not adjustment. Not compromise. Replacement. Quiet, careful, and deliberate. I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor, and began clearing the table. One plate at a time. One glass. One folded napkin. My movements were steady, precise, almost automatic. By the time I reached the last place setting, the one at the far end of the table with Jessica's name card, I paused. My fingers rested on the edge of the plate as I looked down at her name written in ink that had not yet smudged. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel it. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just recognition. Then I picked up the plate, carried it into the kitchen, and set it in the sink like all the others. When I finished, I dried my hands, turned off the lights, and stood alone in the doorway, looking back at the empty room. They thought I would break tonight. They thought I would call, ask questions, demand answers. But they did not understand something important. Silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes, it means someone is finally paying attention. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had refused to rest. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that exists just before sunrise, when everything feels suspended in place. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the night before settle into something more solid, something I could hold on to without questioning whether it had really happened. The message. The email. Jessica's name. It was all still there, clear and unchanged. I sat up slowly and reached for my robe, wrapping it tightly around me as I made my way downstairs. The kitchen felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just me noticing things I had ignored before. I turned on the light above the sink and filled the kettle, watching the water rise as I tried to organize my thoughts into something useful. Panic would not help me. Confrontation would not help me. Not yet. What I needed was time. Time to understand exactly what they were planning and how far they had already gone. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the small table by the window, the same spot where I had spent countless mornings over the years, reading the newspaper or watching the neighborhood wake up. Today, I did neither. Instead, I unlocked my phone again and opened the message thread, studying it more carefully this time. The number was unfamiliar, no name attached, no previous messages. Just that one sentence and the image. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what they were doing. They did not try to explain. They did not ask for anything. They simply placed the truth in front of me and stepped back. I tapped on the image and zoomed in, my eyes moving slowly across the email. Jessica's tone was calm, almost professional, as if she were discussing a routine task. There was no hesitation in her words, no sign of doubt. It will be easier once she is no longer involved. I read that line again, feeling the weight of it settle deeper than before. No longer involved. Not included. Not consulted. Removed. I set the phone down and stared out the window as the first light of morning began to stretch across the street. For a long time, I had believed that distance in a family happened naturally, that children grew up, built their own lives, and slowly drifted away. I had accepted that. I had respected it. But this was not distance. This was design. I thought about Daniel then, about the boy he used to be and the man he had become. There had been a time when he told me everything, when he sought my advice even on the smallest decisions. Now, I could not remember the last time he had asked what I thought about anything that mattered. That change had not happened overnight. It had been gradual, almost invisible, until suddenly it was complete. And Jessica had been there for all of it. Always present. Always guiding. Always just slightly ahead of every decision that affected me. I stood up and walked over to the counter, setting my empty cup in the sink before turning toward the hallway again. The house looked the same as it always had. The furniture had not moved. The photos were still in their frames. But something fundamental had shifted, something I could no longer ignore. I was not standing in the center of this family anymore. I had been moved to the edges without realizing it. And now, according to that message, they were preparing to remove me completely. I did not feel afraid. Not in the way I might have expected. What I felt, instead, was clarity. A quiet, steady understanding that whatever happened next would depend entirely on how I chose to respond. I walked back to the table, picked up my phone, and opened a new contact screen. I did not enter a name yet. I simply stared at the blank space, considering my options carefully. If someone had gone out of their way to warn me, then this was not as simple as it seemed. There were pieces I did not have yet. People I did not know about. And if Jessica had been planning this long enough to write emails like that, then she had likely covered her tracks in ways I had not even begun to consider. I pressed the phone lightly against the table, then finally set it down again without saving anything. Not yet. Rushing would be a mistake. For now, I needed to watch. To listen. To let them believe that nothing had changed. Because sometimes, the only way to understand a plan is to let it unfold a little further. And for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to see everything exactly as it was. By mid-morning, the house had settled into its usual rhythm, but I moved through it differently, as if I were walking through a place I had just begun to understand. I made my bed with the same careful precision, smoothed the sheets, adjusted the pillows, and opened the curtains to let in the light. From the outside, nothing had changed. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen the same routine, the same quiet woman going about her day. That was important. I needed it to look that way. I needed them to believe that last night had passed without consequence. Around 10 o'clock, my phone finally rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, bright and familiar, as if nothing had shifted between us. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of choice. "Mom," he said, his voice light, almost casual, "we got back late last night. Sorry we missed dinner. Things just got a little busy." I stood by the kitchen counter, one hand resting lightly against the surface, and listened to him speak. There was no pause. No careful wording. Just a simple explanation delivered as if it were enough. "That is all right," I replied. My voice steady, even warmer than I expected. I figured something must have come up. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that lingers just long enough to suggest he had not expected such an easy answer. "We should come by later," he added quickly. "Jessica wants to drop something off." Of course she did. "That sounds nice," I said, allowing a softness into my tone that felt almost foreign now. "I will be here." When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the counter and stood there for a moment, letting the conversation replay in my mind. He had not asked how the dinner went. He had not mentioned the photos. He had not even acknowledged the date. It was as if the entire evening had been quietly erased, replaced with a version of events that required no explanation. I moved to the sink and turned on the water, rinsing a dish that was already clean, simply to give my hand something to do. If they were coming here, then whatever Jessica had planned was already in motion. The message had said after her birthday, and now it was after. I dried my hands and walked into the living room, my eyes scanning the space with a new kind of attention. The furniture. The cabinets. The small locked drawer in the corner desk where I kept important papers. I had always believed everything in this house was exactly where it should be, safe and untouched. Now I was no longer certain. I crossed the room slowly and opened the drawer, the familiar click of the lock sounding louder than usual. Inside were documents I had not looked at in months. Property records. Bank statements. Insurance papers. I flipped through them carefully, my fingers steady, my breathing calm. Nothing appeared out of place at first glance, but that did not mean anything. If Jessica had been planning this for as long as it seemed, then whatever changes she intended might not be obvious. Not yet. I closed the drawer and locked it again, pressing my palm lightly against the wood as I thought about the email. Transfer. Property. Easier once she is out. The words aligned too neatly with what sat inside that drawer. I stepped back and looked around the room once more, this time not as a homeowner, but as someone being assessed, measured, and quietly moved aside. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Right on time. I did not rush. I walked at the same steady pace I always had, my expression calm, my posture relaxed. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there with his usual easy smile, and beside him, Jessica, composed as ever, holding a small envelope in her hand. "Happy belated birthday," she said, her voice smooth, her eyes steady on mine. I smiled back, just enough to match her tone. "Thank you," I replied, stepping aside to let them in, already knowing that whatever was inside that envelope was not a gift. I closed the door gently behind them, the soft click echoing longer than it should have, and for a brief moment, I stood there watching as they stepped into the house as if nothing had changed, as if they had not spent the previous evening somewhere else entirely, celebrating a version of family that did not include me. Daniel walked in first, glancing around the living room with a familiar ease, while Jessica followed just half a step behind, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, the envelope still held lightly between her fingers as though it carried no real weight. "The house looks nice," she said, her eyes moving across the room, taking in every detail with a quiet precision that I had never fully noticed until now. I smiled politely and gestured toward the sofa. "Please, sit down," I said, my voice steady, almost welcoming, as if this were any other visit, any other ordinary morning. Daniel sat without hesitation, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together, while Jessica remained standing for a moment longer before finally taking a seat beside him, placing the envelope neatly on her lap. There was a brief pause, the kind that often comes before something important is said, but no one rushed to fill it. I walked to the armchair across from them and sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap just as I had done the night before, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to make them aware of it. "We brought you something," Jessica said finally, lifting the envelope and extending it toward me with a small, practiced smile. I reached out and accepted it without hesitation, my fingers brushing lightly against the smooth paper as I brought it back toward me. It was heavier than it looked. Not physically, but in the way it seemed to carry intention. I turned it over once, noting that my name had been written across the front in Jessica's handwriting, neat and deliberate. "You did not have to," I replied, keeping my tone gentle, appreciative, exactly what they would expect. "It is just a small thing," she said quickly, her eyes watching me closely now, no longer drifting around the room. "We thought it would help simplify things moving forward." Simplify. The word settled in the air between us, quiet but unmistakable. I nodded slowly and opened the envelope, sliding the papers inside out with care, as though I were unwrapping something fragile. The first page was a formal document, printed on crisp white paper, filled with structured paragraphs and legal language that immediately told me what it was, even before I read a single line in detail. I let my eyes move across the top, taking in just enough to confirm what I already knew. Transfer of ownership. Authorization. Signature required. I did not react. Not outwardly. Instead, I adjusted the pages in my hands and looked up at them with a calm expression that felt almost effortless now. "You have been busy," I said softly, as if I were commenting on something ordinary, something expected. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze dropping for a brief second before returning to me. "We just thought it might be easier this way," he said, echoing the same idea, though his voice carried a trace of uncertainty that had not been there before. Jessica remained still, her attention fixed on my face, waiting, measuring, perhaps expecting a question, a hesitation, a sign of resistance. But I gave her none of that. I lowered my gaze back to the document and turned the page slowly, my fingers steady, my breathing even. "Easier once she is out." The words from the message repeated quietly in my mind, aligning perfectly with what sat in front of me now. This was not a suggestion. It was a step. One they believed I would take without understanding where it led. I placed the papers carefully on the table beside me and leaned back in my chair, allowing a small, thoughtful smile to appear, the kind that suggested consideration rather than suspicion. "I see," I said, my voice calm, measured, completely controlled. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were not here to celebrate anything. They were here to finalize something they had already decided without me. And they believed I would simply agree. I did not reach for a pen. Instead, I let my gaze rest on the papers for a few seconds longer, just enough to make it seem like I was considering the details, weighing the decision as any reasonable person would. Then I looked up again, meeting Jessica's eyes directly for the first time since she had walked in. There was something almost imperceptible in her expression now, a quiet anticipation, as if she were waiting for a very specific moment to arrive. "It is a lot to take in all at once," I said calmly, letting my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the document. "These things usually require a bit more thought." Daniel shifted again, this time leaning back slightly, his posture less certain than before. "Of course," he said quickly. "We are not trying to rush you. We just thought it would be good to get things started." Get things started. Another careful phrase. Another step in a process that had clearly been planned long before this morning. I nodded slowly, as if I appreciated the consideration, even though I understood exactly what they were doing. "I appreciate that," I replied, keeping my tone warm, almost reassuring. "It is good to be prepared." Jessica's lips curved into a small smile, but it did not reach her eyes. She was studying me now, searching for something beneath the surface, something that would confirm whether I understood or not. I gave her nothing. I picked up the top page again and glanced at it briefly, just enough to maintain the appearance of engagement, before setting it back down in the same neat stack. "I think it would be wise for me to have someone look over this," I added, as if the thought had only just occurred to me. "Just to make sure I understand everything properly." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Daniel looked at Jessica, just for a moment, a quick glance that might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so carefully. She did not turn to him. She kept her eyes on me, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle tightening around her mouth, a shift so small that most people would have missed it. "It is a standard document," she said, her voice still smooth, still controlled. "There is nothing unusual about it." I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words, then offered a gentle smile. "I am sure there is not," I said. But I have always believed it is better to be certain. Daniel cleared his throat softly. That makes sense, Mom, he said, though his voice carried a faint hesitation now. The certainty he had earlier was beginning to thin, just slightly. I leaned back in my chair again, folding my hands together in my lap, the same calm posture I had maintained since they arrived. Why do not we do this? I continued, my tone light, cooperative. I will take some time to review everything properly. Perhaps speak to someone who can explain the details. Then we can sit down again and go through it together. I watched Jessica closely as I spoke, noting the way her fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the envelope she still held, the way her shoulders remained perfectly still despite the shift in the conversation. This was not the outcome she had expected. Not resistance, but not compliance either. Something in between. Something that delayed her plan without confronting it directly. Of course, she said finally, her voice unchanged, though the pause before her response had been just a fraction too long. Take all the time you need. I nodded once, as if the matter had been settled easily, as if this were simply a practical discussion between family members. But inside, everything had already shifted into place. I understood now that whatever they had prepared depended on my willingness to move quickly, to trust without question, to sign without hesitation. And I had no intention of doing any of those things. I reached for the papers again and slid them neatly back into the envelope, sealing it with a quiet, deliberate motion before placing it on the table beside me. Thank you for bringing this to me, I said softly, meeting their eyes one more time. I will make sure it is handled properly. And as I sat there, calm and composed, I realized something that neither of them seemed to understand yet. Their plan only worked if I stayed exactly who they believed I was. And I was no longer that person. They did not stay long after that. Daniel stood first, offering a polite smile that did not quite settle naturally on his face, while Jessica followed with the same composed grace she had carried into the house, her movements precise, controlled, as if every step had already been rehearsed. I walked them to the door, my hand resting lightly against the frame as I watched them leave, their figures moving down the walkway in quiet synchronization. Daniel said something to her before they reached the car, something I could not hear, and she responded with a slight nod, her attention already shifting elsewhere. When the car pulled away, I did not wave. I simply closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into place. It felt different now, not empty, but purposeful, as if it were giving me space to think. I turned and walked slowly back into the living room, my eyes moving instinctively toward the envelope resting on the table where I had left it. For a few seconds, I did not touch it. I simply looked at it, considering everything it represented, everything it confirmed. Then I picked it up and carried it with me into the study, closing the door behind me with a soft, deliberate motion. The room was smaller, quieter, lined with shelves that held years of documents, records, and memories I had carefully preserved. I placed the envelope on the desk and sat down, pulling the drawer open once more, this time with a clearer purpose. Inside, beneath the familiar papers, was a folder I had not opened in a long time. I slid it out slowly and placed it beside the envelope, my fingers brushing lightly across its surface before opening it. Inside were documents that predated everything Jessica believed she understood about this house. Agreements, signatures, records that had been put in place years ago, long before Daniel had even met her. I flipped through them carefully, my eye scanning each page, not because I had forgotten what they contained, but because I needed to see them again now, in this new context. The ownership structure. The conditions. The clauses that had once seemed like simple precautions now carried a different weight. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath as the pieces began to align more clearly in my mind. Jessica believed this house was something that could be transferred easily, something that only required my signature to change hands. She believed the process was straightforward, predictable, controllable. But she did not know everything. There were details she had not uncovered, layers she had not anticipated, protections that had been quietly put in place long before she entered this family. I closed the folder gently and placed it on top of the envelope, my expression calm, almost thoughtful. This was no longer about reacting. It was about positioning. About understanding exactly when and how to respond in a way that would not just stop what she was trying to do, but reveal it fully. I reached for my phone again, this time with intention, and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years. I hesitated for only a second before pressing it. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, older now, but still steady. "This is Robert Hayes," he said. I allowed a small, composed smile to settle on my face as I spoke. "Robert, it is Margaret Collins," I said, my voice even, controlled. "I believe it is time we reviewed some old documents." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a quiet understanding that needed no further explanation. "I was wondering when you might call," he replied. I ended the call shortly after, placing the phone back on the desk with a sense of clarity I had not felt in a long time. Then I looked once more at the envelope, at the plan that had been placed so confidently in front of me, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself the faintest hint of something deeper than calm. Not anger. Not resentment. Just certainty. They had made their move. Now, I was ready to make mine. Robert arrived the following afternoon, precisely at 2:00, just as he always had years ago when my husband was still alive and these meetings were routine rather than necessary. I watched him walk up the driveway from the front window, his posture unchanged, his briefcase held firmly at his side, a quiet reminder that some things, unlike people, remained consistent over time. When I opened the door, he offered a polite nod instead of a smile, his eyes already carrying the kind of awareness that told me he understood more than I had said over the phone. "Margaret," he greeted, stepping inside without unnecessary formality. "Robert," I replied, closing the door behind him and leading him toward the study where everything had been laid out exactly as I had left it. The envelope. The older folder. The desk cleared of anything that might distract from what truly mattered. He placed his briefcase down carefully and took a seat across from me, opening it with practiced efficiency before pulling out a pair of reading glasses and a small notepad. "Let us take a look," he said simply. I handed him the envelope first, watching as he removed the documents and began to read through them in silence. His expression did not change, but I noticed the slight pause when he reached certain sections, the subtle narrowing of his eyes as he moved from one page to the next. When he finished, he placed the papers neatly back on the desk and looked up at me. "They are moving quickly," he said, his voice calm, measured. "Yes," I replied, folding my hands together. "Faster than they realize they should." He nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected, then reached for the older folder I had placed beside it. This time, as he reviewed the contents, there was a different kind of stillness in the room. Not uncertainty, but recognition. "They did not account for this," he said after a moment, tapping lightly on one of the pages. I leaned back slightly, allowing a small, knowing breath to escape. "No," I said. "They did not." He closed the folder and removed his glasses, setting them carefully on the desk before meeting my gaze directly. "If they proceed the way this document suggests," he continued, gesturing toward the envelope, "they will expose their intentions very clearly. Especially if you allow them to believe you are cooperating." I considered his words, though they aligned perfectly with what I had already begun to understand. "And if I do not sign?" I asked, not because I lacked the answer, but because I wanted to hear it spoken aloud. "Then they will adjust," he replied. "They will find another approach. Likely one that is less transparent." I nodded slowly. That was exactly what I had been thinking. A direct refusal would only force them to become more careful, more concealed. But agreement, or at least the appearance of it, would do the opposite. It would give them confidence. It would make them careless. "Then I believe it would be best if they continued exactly as they are," I said quietly. Robert studied me for a moment, then allowed the faintest hint of approval to pass across his expression. "In that case," he said, reaching for his notepad, "we should make a few preparations of our own." For the next hour, we went through every detail with precision. Dates. Clauses. Conditions that could be activated at the right moment. Documentation that would need to be updated, reviewed, or simply brought forward at exactly the right time. There was no rush in our conversation, no raised voices, no sense of urgency. Just a steady, deliberate process of aligning facts with intention. When we finished, Robert gathered his things and stood, pausing briefly before heading toward the door. "They believe they are in control," he said, his tone neutral but certain. "That belief will work in your favor." I walked him out, thanking him with the same calm composure I had maintained since he arrived, and watched as he left the same way he had come, quiet and assured. When the door closed again, I did not return to the study right away. Instead, I stood in the hallway, looking at the familiar walls, the photographs. The life that had been slowly rewritten without my consent. Then I turned, walked back into the living room, and picked up my phone. There was a message from Daniel, sent just minutes earlier. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Did you get a chance to look at everything?" I read it once, then again, letting the simplicity of the question settle into something almost predictable. Then I typed my response carefully, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. "Yes, I did. It all looks clear. I think we should move forward." I pressed send and set the phone down, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. Outside, everything remained quiet. Inside, the next step had already begun. 3 days later, they returned, this time with a different kind of energy, one that felt lighter, more assured, as if my message had given them exactly the confirmation they needed. I opened the door before they could knock a second time, greeting them with the same calm expression I had practiced so well, the same quiet warmth that made everything feel ordinary. Daniel stepped in first again, but this time his shoulders were more relaxed, his smile more natural, as if something had been resolved in his mind. Jessica followed, her gaze steady, her movements precise, but there was a subtle shift in her posture now, a confidence that had not been there before. She believed the path was clear. "We brought the final copies," she said, holding up a new set of documents, thicker this time, more complete. I nodded and stepped aside, allowing them in without hesitation, guiding them once more into the living room where everything had been arranged exactly as before. The same table. The same chairs. The same quiet space that now held a very different purpose. I took some time to review everything, I said as we sat down, my voice even, measured, giving them exactly what they expected to hear. It all seemed straightforward. Daniel exhaled softly, almost relieved, while Jessica placed the documents carefully on the table between us, aligning them with deliberate precision. "That is good to hear," she replied, her tone smooth, controlled, though I could see the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. I reached for the pen they had brought, turning it once between my fingers as if considering the weight of the moment. Then I looked down at the first page, scanning it slowly, deliberately, allowing the silence to stretch just enough to build anticipation. They watched me closely now. Both of them. Waiting. Measuring. Expecting the final step. I turned one page. Then another. Each movement calm, unhurried, as if nothing about this moment was unusual. But inside, everything had already been decided long before they walked through the door. "There is just one thing," I said finally, setting the pen down gently on the table. The shift was immediate, though subtle. Daniel straightened slightly. Jessica's gaze sharpened, her focus narrowing just enough to reveal her attention had moved from confidence to calculation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still steady, but no longer effortless. I lifted the top document and slid it slightly to the side, revealing a second set of papers beneath it, ones they had not brought, ones that had not been there the last time they visited. Robert had made sure of that. "Before we finalize anything," I continued, my tone calm, almost conversational, "there are a few existing agreements that need to be acknowledged." I watched their expressions carefully as I placed the older documents on the table, turning them just enough so they could read the headings. It took only a second. That was all it took for the change to register. Jessica's eyes moved quickly across the page, her composure holding, but only just. Daniel leaned forward, confusion settling in where certainty had been moments before. "What is this?" he asked quietly. I folded my hands in my lap and met his gaze, not with accusation, not with anger, but with clarity. "This house," I said gently, "was never structured the way you seem to believe." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was not empty. It was not uncertain. It was full. Full of realization. Full of something shifting beneath the surface. Jessica did not speak immediately. She read again, slower this time, her mind adjusting, recalculating, searching for something she had missed. "This does not change the current transfer," she said finally, though her voice carried the faintest trace of strain now, a careful attempt to regain control. I tilted my head slightly, allowing a small, almost sympathetic smile to appear. "It changes everything," I replied softly. I reached for the pen again, not to sign their document, but to tap it lightly against the page in front of me, the sound quiet but deliberate. "You see," I continued, my voice steady, "nothing here can move forward without addressing what was already put in place." Daniel looked between us now, his expression no longer certain, no longer aligned. The foundation he had been standing on had shifted, and for the first time, he could feel it. Jessica, however, remained still, her posture controlled, her expression composed, but her silence said more than any words could. She had not expected this. Not this detail. Not this resistance wrapped in calm. I leaned back slightly, placing the pen down once more, my hands resting comfortably in my lap. "I think it would be best if we take a step back," I said, my tone unchanged, almost gentle. "Review everything properly. Together." No one argued. No one pushed forward. Because in that moment, the plan they had built so carefully had encountered something they had not prepared for. And as I sat there, calm and composed, watching the quiet realization unfold across their faces, I understood something with complete certainty. They had spent all this time trying to move me out of the picture. They never considered that I might already be the one holding the frame.